Alright, we're going to start by looking at factoring. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to review what FOIL is. And remember that when you multiply two binomials, we're going to use the acronym FOIL. Now if you recall, FOIL stands for first, outside, inside, last. And when we need to FOIL something, we look at the first term in each set of parentheses and we multiply those together. So for the first, x times x would be x squared. So that's the F part of FOIL. Now outside, so I'm going to look at the x and this negative 5. So x times negative 5 is negative 5x. That would be the outside. Now the inside, we look at the inside terms and multiply those together. So 3 times x would give me plus 3x. And then L for last. I've got the 3 times the negative 5, and I get a negative 15, and that gives me my last. When I simplify these, I would get x squared minus 2x minus 15. So that's just a quick review of what foiling is. What we're going to do is we're going to look at some relationships here. So I'm going to give you several examples of binomials being multiplied. You want to look for the relationships between the constants of the binomial and the coefficients of the answers. So here's our first one. Our constants for this particular one are 2 and 5. Our coefficients are 7 and 10. So you want to look at how are these constants related to my coefficients. Here's another example. My constants are 8 and 2. So you want to ask yourself, how are 8 and 2 related to the 10 and to the 16? Now this one, my constants are negative 3 and negative 10. And you want to look at how does that relate to this negative 13 and the 30. Next one is negative 7 and negative 5. So how does that relate to my negative 12 and my 35? Hopefully you're noticing some patterns. And now my constants are a negative 4 and a positive 8. So how do those relate to my 4 and my negative 32? And our last one, my constants are negative 6 and 2. How does that relate to negative 4 and negative 12? So be thinking about some generalizations based off of these examples. Now I also want you to go back and think about what does the plus or the minus tell us. So this first one we had a plus, and look at what happened to our equation. Second one was a plus and a plus. Compare that to our equation. Okay, the next two are both minus signs, so look at what the signs changed in our equation. And our last group is one minus sign and one plus sign, so how is that different from those first ones? So be thinking about all those things. Hopefully what you noticed was that the middle term was the sum of the two constants. So if I FOIL this one out, I'm going to have first, outside, inside, last. Well, that simplifies to x squared plus 11x plus 30. And if I look at this middle term, this 11, it's the sum of positive 6 and positive 5. Then, hopefully you noticed that the last term was the product of the two. So positive 6 times positive 5 gives me positive 30. And if you look at the signs, both of these were positive. Everything turned out to be positive in this one. So my last term is the product of these two numbers. My middle term is the sum of these two numbers. Okay, so let's look at the signs again. When I had positive and positive, everything turned out to be positives. But now when I have two negatives, my middle term turns out to be negative, but my last term stayed positive. When I had one of each, my last term turned out to be negative and my middle term changed. It didn't show us any constant pattern. So what can we say about the signs? Hopefully you're noticing that when the signs match, our last term is positive. When the signs don't match, our last term is negative. Okay, so let's deal with this part up here, where our signs match. Our last term is going to be positive. How can we decide what the middle term is going to be? Well, if my signs match as positives, the middle term is going to be positive. If my signs match as negatives, the middle term is going to be negatives. So those are all ideas that you want to keep in the back of your mind. You might be wondering, why is this important? We've done FOIL before. Well, what we're looking at today is factoring, and that's the process of undoing FOIL. So if we can understand these relationships, we can help us undo the FOIL. We're going to take a polynomial, and we're going to undo the foiling and write it as its product of binomials. So when we do that, when we write it as a product of binomials, that's when it might look like x plus 4 times x minus 3. What form does that get us to? Is it our standard form, our vertex form, or our intercept form? We have two sets of parentheses. That matches up with our intercept form. So factoring, this process of undoing the FOIL, takes us to intercept form. So here's our first example we're going to look at. I'm going to go ahead and set up my format for intercept form. I know I need two sets of parentheses. Now I've got to start with this x squared. What can I multiply together to get x squared? Well, that would be an x and an x. Then the next thing I want to look at is this last sign. Now if you remember from the previous slide, when this is a positive, that means my signs in my binomials match. Now I can look at this one and they tell me that they match as plus signs. So I know I'm going to have a plus and a plus. Then the next thing I want to look at is the 12. And I want to think about what things can I multiply together to get 12. Because from that previous slides, we know that this term is the product of whatever numbers we have in here. So the things I can multiply together to get 12 are 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. I'm always going to list them so I can see what they are. Now, before I just go picking one, I want to try to think, well, which ones will get me to a 7 when I add them? Because my last term is the product, my middle term is the sum. Well, as I look through my list, 3 and 4 will give me a sum of 7, so I'm going to try those first. Once you're at this point, you can't just assume you're right. You actually have to FOIL it out to check it. So I'm going to go ahead and FOIL this out, and I'm going to get x squared plus 4x plus 3x plus 12. And when I simplify that, I have x squared plus 7x plus 12. And you want to check, is that what I started with? So I've got the x squared plus 7x plus 12 matches identical to what I get when I FOILed these back together. So this is actually the correct answer. So my factored problem would be x plus 3 and x plus 4. Okay, here's two more example problems. Let's see, I'm going to set up my sets of parentheses and I look at my x squared. I know it has to be x and x. Now I look at my plus sign on the very last term. That tells me the signs match. And when I glance up at this next symbol, that tells me they match as plus signs. So I know I'm going to have a plus and a plus. Now I can go back to my 9, and I want to think about what things can I multiply together to get 9. Well, I can do 1 and 9 or 3 and 3. I look at my 10, and I have to ask myself which set will give me a 10 when I add them together. Well, it looks like the 1 and 9 are going to work out, because 1 plus 9 gives me a 10. So now I check it by foiling. So I'm going to have x squared plus 9x plus 1x plus 9. And I get x squared plus 10x plus 9. And you want to compare, does that match exactly what we started with? And since it does, that means we got it on our first try here. So when we factored, it turned out to be x plus 1 and x plus 9. Okay, here's another one. Look at my front term, x squared. The only things I can multiply together are x and x. Now I look at my plus sign, and that means that they match. My signs in my binomials are going to match. When I look up here, that means they match as negatives. So I'm going to have two minuses. Then I go to my 6 and I list what I can multiply together to get 6. So it's going to be 1 and 6 or 2 and 3. Now I've got to ask myself which ones when added together will give me that negative 5. Ooh, this one, not so sure because 6 minus 1 is 5 and 3 plus 2 is 5. So you might have to try each of those. But what I'm going to think about is I know both of them have to be negative. So I'm going to ask myself, is negative 1 plus a negative 6 going to give me 5? Or is negative 2 plus negative 3 going to give me 5? And it is going to be the negative 2 and the 3. So I'm going to use the 2 and the 3. I'm going to FOIL it out to check it. And when I do that and I simplify it, I get x squared minus 5x plus 6, which is what I started with. So when it's factored, it's x minus 2 and x minus 3. Okay, give these two a shot. See if you can get them factored. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can factor each of these. Okay, for the first one, hopefully you've got at least x and x. And then this minus sign on the very back tells me that they don't match, so I know I have 1 plus and I have 1 minus. Then I listed my multiples of 8, which are my factors of 8, which are 1 and 8, 2 and 4. And then I've got to try to figure out which ones will give me a 7. Well, now keep in mind, 1 is positive and 1 is negative. So when I take an 8 and a 1, those are going to get me to my 7. Now you might not know which one goes where. So let's say you guessed with an 8 here and a 1 here. You need to FOIL it out to check it. So you'll end up with x squared minus 1x plus 8x minus 8. Simplify that down, you get x squared plus 7x minus 8. We're really close, but not quite, because we needed to have a minus 7, and we ended up with a plus 7. But the good news is I got the right number, just the wrong sign. So all I need to do is change my signs in my binomials. So instead of x plus 8, it'll be x minus 8. And instead of x minus 1, it'll be x plus 1. I still need to FOIL that out just to double check. So I'm going to have x squared plus 1x minus 8x minus 8. And when I simplify that, I get x squared minus 7x minus 8. Which is exactly what we started with, so I know I've got it factored right. Okay, the second one. Start out with your x and your x. The minus sign means they don't match, so I'm going to have 1 plus and 1 minus. Now my factors of 45. 1 and 45. 3 and 15. 5 and 9. Let's see, I think that's all of them. Now I need to try to figure out which ones are going to get me to the 4 when I add them together. But again, one's positive and one's minus, so you got to think in terms of subtraction actually. And when I look at this, my 9 and my 5 are 4 away from each other. So I'm going to go ahead and put my 9 up here and my 5 back here. I'm going to FOIL it out to try it. So I've got first, outside, inside, last. Simplify that down, and we got it right on the first try. It matches exactly what we started with, so we've got it factored right here. Okay, go ahead and give these problems a shot, see if you can get all 3 of them factored, and bring them with you to class.